Florida dumped mountains of discarded oyster shells into the Gulf. What rose from that underwater graveyard stunned scientists, silenced critics, and began rebuilding an ecosystem no one believed could come back. Nobody expected anything worth noticing. Critics called it careless ocean dumping. Fishermen worried it would finish off what little was left of Florida's damaged coastal waters. Even the scientists running the program steeled themselves for disappointment. But something happened on that Gulf seafloor that broke every prediction, every timeline, and every rule about how nature is supposed to work. A lifeless patch of ocean bottom started turning into something alive, faster, thicker, and far more complex than any of the data had predicted. What took shape down there was not just a reef. It was something that is still growing today. And the way it happened will change how you think about the ocean. The ocean experiment nobody believed would work. Between 2007 and 2024, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission carried out one of the most debated coastal experiments the state had ever tried. The idea was almost unbelievably simple. Gather discarded oyster shells from restaurants and seafood processors across Florida, haul them to the coast, load them onto barges, and drop them into the Gulf of Mexico near Cedar Key. More than 500,000 tons of them. It is worth thinking about how ordinary the raw material was. Shells scraped off plates, shells piled behind processing plants by the truckload. All of it was otherwise headed for a landfill. No lab-made base, no engineered mix, no costly imported material, just waste. And that plainness was exactly why so few people believed anything important could come from it. The pushback came fast and it came hard. Environmental groups called it ocean dumping dressed up as conservation. They warned that the shells would bury whatever fragile life still held on to the soft sandy floor. Local fishermen whose families had worked those waters for generations feared buried sediment, changed currents, and the loss of fishing grounds they had depended on for a century. This was not some fringe complaint. It was loud. It was believable. And it was based on real ecological worry. People who had spent their whole lives reading those waters were sure the plan would do real harm. Still, the commission moved forward. Their reasoning was direct. These shells were going to landfills anyway. There was even a small chance they could serve as reef substrate. The risk was worth taking. In the worst case, you have simply moved waste. In the best case, you have given the Gulf the one thing it could no longer make for itself: a hard surface for life to grab onto. Here is the twist. Nobody, not even the scientists who built the program, actually thought it would work this quickly. When the first monitoring crews returned to the drop sites 18 months after the first deposits, they came ready for the worst. Silt-covered mounds, a scattering of opportunistic organisms at best, and a long, slow wait before anything like a reef appeared. What they found instead made Dr. Krimsky, a shellfish habitat specialist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, stop cold in the middle of a team debrief. Life was moving onto the shell mounds, not in 2 or 3 years, the usual pace for any artificial reef effort, but in months. Clusters of marine organisms were taking hold at rates that had no match anywhere in the scientific record. The shells were not sitting there like lifeless rubble. They were acting like biological triggers, and no one could fully explain the speed of it. But here is what nobody saw coming. To understand why it was moving so fast, you had to look at something so tiny it was almost invisible. The answer was not in the fish, or the oysters, or anything a diver could photograph. It was happening at a scale that needed a microscope. And what was happening at that scale was stranger than anyone had guessed. The invisible phase, the tiny life that rebuilt an ecosystem. The first colonizers were not fish. They were not oysters. They were bacteria. Within days of the shells settling on the seafloor, microscopic bacteria began spreading across the calcium carbonate surfaces, forming thin biofilms, structured living sheets that turned dead shell into a working microhabitat. These were not scattered random smears of bacteria. They were organized biological groundwork, setting the stage for everything that would come next. Think of it like a foundation being poured before a single wall goes up. No one standing on the surface of the water would ever have known it was happening. And here is the remarkable part. The shells were driving their own chemistry. Oyster shells are made mostly of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves in seawater. As the shells released calcium ions, they created small alkaline pockets in the water around them. Those local chemical shifts were exactly what calcifying creatures, barnacles, tube worms, and young oysters needed to latch on and grow. The shells were not just offering a surface to cling to. They were creating the very conditions for their own colonization. The material was not passive at all. It was actively shaping the chemistry of the water in a way that invited life. That detail is easy to skip past, but it is central to the whole story. A slab of concrete or a sunken steel hull gives an organism a place to sit. It does nothing to change the water. The shells did both surface and chemistry at once. And that combination is what set the Gulf floor apart from every other artificial structure sunk before. Weeks later, diatoms and microalgae moved into the biofilms, laying down the foundation of a basic food web. Tiny crustaceans and larval mollusks arrived next. Those grazers pulled in the first juvenile fish. Each stage fed the one above it. A self-reinforcing loop was building itself, invisibly, out of leftover seafood scraps. One layer of life created the conditions for the next and the next and the next in a sequence that built on itself with no outside push. Here is what that means. A sandy seabed cannot do this. Sand gives nothing to attach to. No chemical microzones, no structural depth. The soft Gulf bottom was biologically stuck. Not because life did not want to grow there, but because there was no starting point. The shells stepped around that trap completely. They gave the system the one missing ingredient, and the system did the rest. By the end of the first 6 months, the shell surfaces were coated in layered biofilm and microalgae. To a passing observer, the site still looked like a failure, just dull mounds on the seafloor. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a headline. But Dr. Krimsky's water samples and sediment cores told a different story. In less time than a normal artificial reef takes to show any biological signs at all, the shell deposits had already built a full microscopic ecosystem. The gap between what the eye could see and what the data showed was enormous. The invisible phase was the hidden scaffolding. Without the bacteria, without the aragonite chemistry, without the biofilm feeding the first grazers, there is no reef, just calcium, just sand. Every visible thing that came later, every fish and octopus and returning sea turtle rested on this unseen groundwork. The scaffolding was in place. If this is already blowing your mind, hit subscribe, because what came next made the scientists rethink everything they believed about how reefs get built. The return of the reef builders. Oysters need hard surfaces to survive. That single limit had been quietly choking Florida's Gulf Coast for decades. Oyster larvae, called spat, drift on the current in search of substrate. They have a short window in which to find a hard surface and cement themselves to it. Miss that window, land on soft sand, and they die. In a healthy reef system, that substrate is the piled-up shells of earlier generations. Centuries of dead oysters stacked into a hard, complex platform that filters water, holds back erosion, and shelters an estimated 300 different species. A reef, in other words, is built by the reef. Each generation leaves the raw material for the next. But Florida's natural reefs had been hollowed out. Overharvesting, pollution, and coastal development had torn apart a network that once stretched across hundreds of square miles. When the old shell platforms were dredged up, dug out, or buried, the cycle lost its foundation. By the early 2000s, larvae were drifting through open water with almost nowhere to land. No substrate meant no settlement, which meant no new oysters, which meant no new shells for the generation after that. The cycle had snapped, and the Gulf had no way to mend it on its own. Left alone, the system had no path back. The dumped shells cleared that bottleneck almost at once. Each pile was a concentrated landing pad placed exactly where Gulf currents would deliver drifting spat. Suddenly, the larvae that had been dying in open water had somewhere to go. Within the first year, University of Florida Marine Lab researcher Dr. Bill Pine recorded juvenile oysters fastening to the deposited shells in numbers that blew past the projections. The larvae were finding surface, settling, and starting to grow. The broken cycle had a foundation again. By the second year, those juveniles had become reproductive adults. They were releasing larvae of their own, which settled on the existing reef and stacked a second generation onto the structure. This is the moment the project stopped being a human intervention and became a natural process. Human hands had set up the starting conditions, dropped the shells, chosen the sites, but nature had taken it from there completely. Nobody had to add anything more. The oysters were now doing the work themselves. Here is the deal. By year 3, surveys were counting an average of 847 oysters per cubic meter of deposited shell. Nearby, Soft bottom areas with no substrate held almost none. That contrast is the whole story in a single statistic. Same water, same currents, same larvae drifting overhead. The only difference was the presence of a hard surface. And the reefs were no longer limited to their original drop zones. Oysters were dying, adding their shells and creating substrate for the next wave. Vertical growth, horizontal spread. The reef was building itself. Exactly the way a natural reef always had before the natural ones were destroyed. Then came the moment that shifted the whole conversation around the project. Charter Captain Mike Lent had been one of the fiercest opponents of the Shell program from the start. He had testified against it. He had warned it would wreck the fishing grounds his family had worked for 3 generations. He was not a casual critic. He was a man with a century of family knowledge of those waters, and every instinct he had told him the plan was a mistake. 2013, standing at the rail of his boat above one of the established reef sites, Lent watched a heavy school of redfish holding in the current around a shell mound and said something he had never planned to say. I was wrong. I have never seen fish stack up like that in 25 years. On this water. That reversal was not just one man changing his opinion. Was the moment the scientific evidence and the lived experience of the Gulf Coast finally lined up. The data and the fishermen were, for the first time, telling the same story. And the fish were only the beginning of what these reefs were about to do. When the fish arrived, everything changed. Reef fish do not wait for an invitation. The moment structural complexity shows up on a featureless seafloor, they find it. A bare sand bottom offers nothing. No shelter, no ambush points, no feeding surface. A reef offers all 3. Within 2 years of the reefs taking hold, fish surveys near Cedar Key were coming back with numbers that made Dr. Pine's team recheck their methods because the results seemed too strong to be real. Biomass around the reef sites had climbed more than 340% compared with control areas. Species diversity was up 280%. These were not fish drifting in from somewhere else. They were juveniles surviving in habitat that had never supported them before. The reefs were producing life, not gathering it. Producing it. The word matters. And we will come back to why redfish showed up first, tucking into the tangled shell structure to feed and hide from predators. Sheepshead came next, feeding on the invertebrate communities coating the hard surfaces. Flounder worked the edges, lying in wait where the reef met open bottom. Snook appeared in numbers those waters had not seen in years. Each species fit into a different niche the reef had created. And every niche that filled up made the whole system a little richer. And here is the thing, Mike Lent was not the only captain to change his stance. Charter operators up and down Cedar Key started formally asking the commission for new reef sites near popular fishing grounds, the very commission they had been fighting 6 years earlier. The people who had shown up to public meetings to oppose the program were now lining up to ask for more of it. Hotels, bait shops, and waterfront restaurants all reported measurable revenue increases tied directly to the marine surge around the reefs. What had been sold as conservation was turning out to be economics, too. The ecological cascade kept rising. Octopuses claimed territories in the reef's complex crevices, using the gaps and overhangs as dens. Sea turtles came back, feeding on the invertebrate communities. Dolphins were spotted hunting methodically along the reef edges, working the thick fish concentrations the way a predator works any reliable food source. Every new arrival strengthened the food web beneath it. The system was growing more complex, more stable, and more resilient with every season. This is what a recovering ecosystem looks like. Not one species returning, but layer after layer of them, each one supported by the ones below. What made this ecologically important, not just impressive, was what the data confirmed about the kind of change taking place. Dr. Pine's team was careful to separate fish aggregation from fish production. And that difference is the line between an illusion and a real recovery. Artificial reefs made of concrete or sunken ships are known for concentrating fish that already live in an area, basically moving a fixed population around a new landmark. Drop a wreck on the bottom and fish will gather at it. But you have not made more fish. You have just given the existing ones a place to gather. That can look dramatic on a survey without meaning any real increase in marine life. The Cedar Key reefs were something else. Juvenile fish counts, animals born in those waters and surviving to adulthood right there, were the main engine of the increase. The reefs were not just a gathering point for fish that already existed. They were creating survival conditions that had not existed before, letting young fish live to maturity where before they would have died. That difference mattered enormously to how Florida's fisheries managers imagined the program's future. They were not looking at a clever way to relocate fish. They were looking at a way to grow more of them. But fish were only part of the story. Something else was happening to the water itself. Something no one had predicted, with consequences that reached far beyond the reef. The billion-gallon cleaning machines beneath the waves. A single adult oyster filters somewhere between 30 and 50 gallons of seawater every day. On its own, that is a curiosity. But run that figure across hundreds of thousands of oysters thriving on the restored reefs, and it becomes something staggering. Entire reef systems were now processing billions of gallons of Gulf water daily, pulling out suspended particles, excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and agricultural runoff with no machinery, no electricity, and no upkeep cost. Nature had assembled an industrial-scale water treatment plant out of discarded restaurant waste, and it ran itself. The Gulf Coast has a chronic runoff problem. Nitrogen and phosphorus from farms and urban sprawl pour into coastal waters non-stop, feeding the harmful algal blooms that cloud the water, choke out marine life, and periodically trigger mass fish kills. For decades, those blooms had defined damaged Gulf ecosystems, a problem everyone recognized and nobody could solve cheaply. The oyster reefs were hitting it at the source, filtering out the very nutrients that fed the blooms. Here is what that means. Water clarity around the reef sites started improving in measurable ways within just a few years. Dissolved oxygen levels rose. Nutrient concentrations fell. And the gains were not staying in one place. They were spreading outward, reaching surrounding waters in a widening radius around each site. Cleanup that began at the reef did not end at the reef. It spread across the surrounding seafloor. Clearer water let sunlight reach deeper. Seagrass, a vital habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, depends on light to survive. When the water is murky, the light cannot reach it and the grass dies off. As the reefs cleared the water, seagrass beds began pushing back into zones that had been too murky for them for years. And here is the thing. Seagrass then stabilized the sediment, which cut turbidity even more, which let in more light, which fueled more seagrass. A second self-reinforcing feedback loop kicked off from the first, sending benefits rippling across the entire coastal system. One recovery was triggering another. Researchers estimated that the filtration alone from the 500,000 tons of shells laid down between 2007 and 2024 was worth tens of millions of dollars. Value that would have required extraordinary mechanical infrastructure to match. Building a plant capable of processing that much water and maintaining it year after year would have cost a fortune. Nature was doing it for free and getting better at it every season as the reefs grew. The results did not stay in Florida. Word of the Cedar Key outcome spread through coastal management circles, and other states took notice. Alabama launched its own shell recycling program by 2015. Mississippi followed. Louisiana kicked off large-scale reef-building efforts. The Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor applied the same idea in one of the most polluted urban waterways in North America, proving the model was not tied to the warm, shallow Gulf. The idea was spreading because everywhere it was tried, it worked. The concept coming out of all this had a name. Researchers started using more and more circular environmental design. The idea that materials once written off as waste, oyster shells, coral fragments, limestone, rubble, could be repurposed as working ecological infrastructure. Not as a stopgap, not as a way to feel good about dumping something, but as a deliberate design strategy with measurable returns. Florida's project had not just restored a reef. It had proved a philosophy that was starting to reshape how conservation engineering tackles damaged coastlines. International interest arrived quickly. Coastal engineers in Canada, Australia, and Europe began studying the Florida model, searching for nature-based answers to problems they had always met with concrete and steel. Traditional artificial reef programs, sunken ships, and reef balls had one consistent flaw. They concentrated fish that already lived nearby without creating any new biological production. The underlying cycles of reproduction, filtration, and habitat creation were missing. You could sink 1,000 reef balls and never trigger the processes that make a reef alive. Oyster shell reefs were fundamentally different. They did not just provide structure. They restarted the biological processes that decades of Human activity had disrupted, and they kept running without any further investment. But one test still lay ahead, one nobody had designed, one that would show up without warning and settle. The question of whether these reefs were truly built to last. The hurricane test no one planned. September 2017 Hurricane Irma. Category 4. Winds topping 150 miles per hour, catastrophic storm surge, waves slamming the Gulf. Coast with enough force to strip beaches and rearrange shorelines overnight. Coastal communities near Cedar Key. Braced for the kind of destruction these storms reliably bring. Nobody had built the reefs as a hurricane defense, but a hurricane was about to test them anyway. When damage assessors worked their way through the area after Irma had passed, they found something that brought the conversation to a halt. Shorelines protected by the restored Oyster reefs had suffered dramatically less erosion than unprotected stretches nearby. On average, erosion was cut by 30 to 40%, compared with nearby soft sand beaches. The difference was visible from a boat. One stretch of coast chewed away, the next stretch sitting behind a reef mostly intact. The reefs had worked as natural wave breakers. Their dense, irregular, three-dimensional structure, layers of living oysters stacked on layers of shell, rough and complex, absorbed and scattered wave energy before it reached the shore at full strength. A wave rolling toward a smooth surface keeps its momentum. A wave hitting a jagged, porous reef loses it, broken apart by friction and by the countless small gaps and edges the reef presents. No smooth surface for waves to race along. Just resistance cutting down wave height, protecting the land behind. Here is the deal. Engineers estimated the reefs had prevented roughly $3 million in coastal property damage during Irma alone. The total cost of the entire 15-year restoration program was about $5 million. In a single storm, one event nobody had planned for, the reefs had nearly paid for themselves. And unlike a seawall, they had cost nothing to maintain in the years leading up to that storm. But here is something seawalls simply cannot do. Seawalls crack. Riprap shifts. Steel corrodes. Concrete eventually gives out. Every piece of hard coastal engineering begins failing the day it is installed. The oyster reefs, by contrast, are self-repairing. Storm damage triggers fresh larval settlement. The disturbance exposes new surface and new oysters move in. Each new generation adds height and structural complexity. The barrier was growing stronger after every storm, not weaker. A seawall is at its best on day one and declines from there. A reef is at its worst on day one and improves for as long as it lives. Coastal engineers and policymakers who had dismissed oyster restoration as a fringe conservation project suddenly had a problem. They had no convincing argument against it. What had begun as a controversial waste disposal plan had quietly become one of the most cost-effective coastal defense systems ever documented on the American Gulf Coast. The Irma data set off a broader rethink in coastal management circles. For decades, the default answer to shoreline erosion had been hard engineering. Seawalls, riprap, concrete barriers. Those approaches were costly to install, demanded constant maintenance, and often failed under the exact extreme storm conditions they were meant to withstand. The oyster reef results introduced a rival logic. Let biology do the structural work. Let organisms that have been engineering coastlines for millions of years do what they evolved to do, and do it for free. The cost gap alone was staggering. Traditional shoreline armoring usually runs hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per mile. The Cedar Key Reef Program delivered similar or better erosion protection at a fraction of that. And the protection got better every year without extra spending. One approach drains a budget forever. The other pays for itself and then keeps paying. And the most extraordinary part was still unfolding. The living structures that refused to stay still. By the early 2020s, the Florida reefs had done something no artificial reef in the region had managed. They had grown beyond their original footprint. Substantially and measurably. The oldest sites had roughly doubled in total area since the first deposits, expanding outward in every direction from the original shell mounds with no further human input. Nobody dropped a single extra shell at those sites. The reef simply grew the way a forest grows once the first trees take root. The engine was the oyster reproductive cycle itself. Each generation settled on existing structure, matured, died, and left shell. For the next wave of larvae. Vertical buildup, horizontal creep. The reef was engineering its own expansion generation by generation with no help needed. Living reef is a machine for making more of itself. The structural complexity had grown dramatically over 15 years. The early deposits were rough mounds of loose calcium, crude, barely more than piles. The living reefs that emerged were architecturally elaborate. Vertical profiles, gaps between dense oyster clusters, overhangs, interlocking surfaces forming dozens of distinct microhabitats. Crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish were all using different structural features at once, each carving out its own zone within the larger whole. Not a substrate, an ecosystem. And here is the thing. Researchers were now finding evidence that dense oyster reefs lock organic carbon into their shells and the surrounding sediments, trapping greenhouse gases that would otherwise feed ocean acidification and atmospheric warming. Benefit nobody had even been looking for showed up in the data. Oyster restoration started appearing in climate adaptation strategies, not just for habitat recovery and coastal defense, but for carbon management. The ecological case had widened into a climate case almost by accident. Of restaurant scraps was now part of the conversation about greenhouse gases. Biodiversity readings at the mature sites were nearing levels recorded on pristine natural limestone reefs. The gold standard, the kind of reef that takes nature untold years to build. Endangered sea turtles returned. Dolphins hunted the reef edges methodically, working the dense fish concentrations. The Gulf was rebuilding itself around the oysters, and the oysters were rebuilding themselves around the Gulf. The two had become a single system, feeding each other. The reefs were not gathering existing marine life. They were generating new life continuously, season after season, without any help. The long-term path pointed toward something restoration scientists rarely dare to claim, a self-sustaining system that no longer needs human management. The shell deposits of 2007 had started a cycle now continuing itself indefinitely. The people who started it could walk away and it would keep going. Each oyster that lived and died added substrate for the next generation. Each generation stretched the reef's footprint. Each expansion built new habitat, filtered more water, protected more shoreline, and supported more species. Every part of the cycle strengthened every other part. The intervention had ended. The ecosystem had not. Was running on its own biological momentum, and the data suggested it would keep going for decades, maybe centuries. The outcome had been unthinkable in 2007 when critics were calling it reckless dumping and even the scientists were bracing for failure. By the early 2020s, it was measurable fact sitting in the survey data and visible from the deck of any boat that passed over the sites. Should every coastline on Earth be doing this? Or are we missing something the Gulf is about to reveal? Hit subscribe. And check out the next video on your screen because the science on where oyster restoration goes from here is even more extraordinary than what you have just seen. 500,000 tons of oyster shells discarded, written off, tipped into the Gulf with no guarantee that a single useful thing would come from it. And look what formed.